So now I take the liberty to kick us off for this event, which is Affordable Aspirations, Mitigation, Adaptation and Finance. The time for this could not be more pressing. The impacts of climate change are being felt all over the world, but they are far from equal. As countries most exposed to these events are in the global south, and not only will they be most impacted, but they have contributed least to climate change and generally have fewer resources to manage the climate impacts. Because of this, in 2009, developed countries set a target to mobilize at least 100 billion per year in climate finance for developing countries by 2020 to 2025. The most recent year reported by the OECD was 2020, when developed countries mobilized 83.3 billion. So this means the target has not been met. In light of this failure, the target was extended to 2025. However, this has been mixed because the 100 billion target represents two goals: mitigation and adaptation. For mitigation, countries allocating funds have largely been on track for this. The international community was near above the 50 billion mark. This means that the deficit in climate finance comes mostly from adaptation. For example, in 2020, climate finance for mitigation was 48.6 billion, while it was only less than 30 billion for adaptation. This is extremely problematic because without investment into adaptation, entire regions could face severe precarity and instability, even if our emissions were halted. In this discussion, we will assess how we can structure climate action and investments in a way that allows us to align the global energy transition, which we really have to quickly realize, with climate resilience and adaptation. We also hope to cover how we can do this in conjunction with other development goals rather than at their expense. I again welcome you to this very prestigious panel. I would like to introduce our distinguished guests for tonight, who will share their expertise on a variety of questions. And I hope that over the course of this dinner, we will be able also to get more of an exchange around the table. But first of all, let me introduce to you Dr. Nageswaran, who is the Chief Economic Advisor of the Government of India. Ms. Mallika Ishwaran, who is the Chief Economist of Shell International UK. Natalie Tocci, who is Director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, Italy. And Amar Bhattacharya, who is Senior Fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development of the Brookings Institute in the United States, but also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. I must unfortunately announce that Ms. Vera Songwe will not be able to attend this meeting, so we have one less panelist for this session. I would like to open the discussion with a very broad question. How do we align the energy transition imperative with the development agenda? Natalie, you have written a book that is called A Green and Global Europe, where you also highlight what could go wrong if the energy transition is ill-managed. Could you give us your viewpoint? How do you think these different development agendas can align, and what is crucial for countries to take into account for this to be successful?
Green is great, and eventually it will be more equitable, certainly more survivable, and surely more prosperous. But the point is that the journey is going to be a very bumpy one. And that's really the sort of starting point, I think, of this reflection, because we talk about it in terms of transition, but in many respects, what we are talking about is something that is more akin to a revolution, in the sense that it's a 360-degree transformation in the way in which we live, we work, we enjoy, we do many, many things. And all revolutions have got winners and losers. And so if we're serious about it, and we should be serious about it, otherwise we all fry, what we have to do is think very hardly about how is it that not only we reward the winners, but above all, we compensate the losers or the potential losers. Because unless we do, then either this is not going to happen in time, and it will happen. It will happen because it makes market sense, and it will happen because it makes technological sense. And other transitions have happened in the past, but other transitions have taken far too long, and they have not been driven by the climate crisis and the way in which this transition is. So this is a far more complex transition that needs to take place in a much, much shorter time frame. And therefore, if we're serious about it, we have to think through not only about the energy and climate implications of this, but the social, economic, and therefore political and geopolitical implications of this essentially revolutionary change. And I think it's useful to think about it both in terms of what happens within countries as well as what happens between countries. And how is it that we avoid, again, going back to this idea of there will be winners and losers, how do we avoid that we're into this bind? Looking at it within countries, and this is something that has been already really quite evident, particularly in advanced countries, there is the risk of enhancing, of the transition journey, enhancing socioeconomic disparities. We saw the first inklings of this, if we think about France, 2019, the Gilets jaunes protest. If we think about what lies in store, think Gilets jaunes on steroids, basically, and across different countries. Now, it's not as if we don't think about the finance implications of this. If we think about it from a European perspective, we have things like a Just Transition Fund, a Climate Social Fund, precisely to mitigate those potential inequalities that would otherwise increase. However, the sums that we're thinking about are completely inappropriate considering the challenge at stake. And let me just give you a couple of figures to really bring this point home. So 27 member states of the European Union, 7-year budget cycle. We have a Just Transition Fund of 17 billion. We add onto this a climate social fund, another 40 billion or so, and you would say, well, this is a kind of fair amount of money. If we think about how much was spent in only 1 year with the energy crisis, in 1 year, 800 billion across all European countries. Now, the energy crisis has similar and also different characteristics, obviously, from the challenges stemming from the transition, but it gives you a sense of the order of magnitude, basically, that we're thinking about. If when we then apply that same argument, not within countries, but between them, this is where we get into the debate, in the sense that we're having this evening, right, about climate finance, mitigation, adaptation. Again, here, it's not as if we're not aware of the challenge. I mean, how many years have we now been talking about 100 billion on climate finance? But again, we obviously already now know that the sums, so that the concept is right, the sums that we're talking about are vastly underestimating the challenge at hand. Now, essentially, if we were to tackle this through money, it would just require, and certainly public money, it would just require too much money. We simply don't have it. And therefore, this is where this also gets us, and here I'm looking in a sense to my right, it gets us to the role that not only obviously public institutions have to play, but private institutions have to play as well. As I said, the magnitude of change is such that it is literally a 360-degree effort that has to be made. I've already probably spoken far too much, so I'll probably just stop there. But simply, again, to highlight the fact that, yes, we should be, if we're talking about both mitigation and adaptation, it's a finance conversation, but it's also especially, I mean, the adaptation conversation is mainly a finance conversation. The mitigation conversation is mainly, I would say, a conversation about what are the institutional and policy incentives that have to be put in place in terms of regulation, in terms of carbon pricing, etc., in order to induce the private sector to really do the heavy lifting on this. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. And thank you also for keeping this first intervention brief, so we can also have enough time to really get into a dialogue with each other. And I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned the losers of this transition. And of course, there's two sets of losers: those who will lose money that is invested in current fossil industries, but also those who are confronted with the realities of climate change. And this is where why we also focus in this session on adaptation, and to keep also the most vulnerable in mind in this discussion. I would like to turn to you, Dr. Nageswaran, and ask you, how does a country like India, a major emerging economy with rapidly growing emissions, albeit very low per capita emissions, ensure it develops in a way that balances resilient green growth?
I think to some extent I can say that both Kira and Natalie stole some of my words. Okay, by talking about the importance of adaptation. You mentioned this in your early remarks, initial remarks as well. So obviously, from a conceptual perspective, we can say that for India, this can be a win-win proposition because we are trying to diversify our dependence on imported fossil fuels anyway. So this probably adds an additional dimension of urgency and priority, and therefore it will serve not only our climate related goals, but also will reduce our dependence on fossil fuels if we switch to more sustainable sources of energy. So where I probably think the answer lies is also not just in terms of funding, which I don't want to trivialize that. Funding is an issue, as you pointed out. The second challenge which we will face, and while we're already ahead in terms of our current targets for the shifting the balance between fossil fuels and renewable energy, the goals we have set for 2030 to at least have half our energy needs coming from renewable energy sources, we are on our way to meeting the target. But the two other dimensions are equally important. If we have to continue this, obviously we can't stop at 2030 and say we have done our job and the job is finished. And that is where I think global cooperation is essential beyond funding, which is that in 2022 June, 12 countries announced a global minerals partnership, critical minerals partnership. And India is not one of them. Not many developing countries are part of it. This is more of a buyer or a user club of critical minerals. Now, we know that critical minerals and rare earths are produced in a few countries, and processing is even more concentrated, while the buyers and users are going to be spread out all over the world. Now, what is likely to happen is that just as oil got weaponized, crude oil got weaponized as a geopolitical tool, rare earths and critical minerals can get weaponized, especially since production and processing are both concentrated. And 12 countries led by the United States and some European countries and a couple of Asian nations have formed this global minerals partnership. So my concern is that in order to marry both development and energy transition, developing countries like India and even less developing, even more so, other low income and poorer countries need to have adequate supply over a long period of critical minerals and rare earths. And we haven't created a pathway for that at all. And that can lead to both geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions and affect both development and energy transition goals. I think that is an issue that is of importance to India. Otherwise, so far, financing has not been a challenge for India because we have been doing it mostly out of our own internal resources. And we are on our way to meeting the targets for 2030. But from the long term, India will not be able to, or for that matter, several other countries will not be able to pursue this development and transition approach without having a secure supply of rare earths and critical minerals, some of which are essential, not just for producing batteries, lithium, but even for wind and renewable energy, we need this metal. That is going to be the challenge for India to be able to marry both the objectives. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And I think this topic also raises the question of sustainability, social standards, also along supply chains. The whole question of biodiversity impacts of resource exploitation that are needed to really kick off the energy transition in all countries. So thank you very much for these very important remarks. Mallika, I would like to turn to you, as you have been indirectly mentioned as representing a private company, an industry that also has a large environmental footprint. What role can it play in the field of climate mitigation and adaptation? Is there a role for adaptation in this area? And also, how do you see this alignment of the energy transition and the development goals, the sustainable development goals?
Thank you for that. You cannot have development without climate mitigation and vice versa. I mean, there was quite a powerful sort of study that the UN did in 1.5 report that looked at the linkages between achieving sustainable development goals and decarbonizing energy supply, energy demand, land use. And really, the overwhelming message that came out of that was that the synergies between these two agendas really dwarf the trade-offs that you might see. So really, for us, it's something that we see intimately linked. We've done work and where we plotted out for Indonesia last year their decarbonization pathway. And the title was Transitioning to an Inclusive and Sustainable Energy Future. And it was really, it brought together both the need to provide and meet the development objectives while mitigating climate change, particularly for a country like Indonesia, which is so susceptible, rising sea levels affecting coastal cities, ocean acidification affecting, sort of coastal livelihoods. And all these storms intensifying. So it brings it really home that you need these two agendas need to be taken really together. It's not a choice between energy transition or sustainable development. The choice is really energy transition and sustainable development. And how can we be clever in finding ways of overlap between the two and doubling down on those. Now, in terms of what Shell does, I mean, I think on mitigation, it's easier to see because we have obviously a big player in the energy system. So for us, we have a target to reduce by 50% the emissions that we ourselves produce. And then by 2050 to be net zero. So, and that's part of changing our portfolio away from what we have today towards low carbon. So and I think that's really important in terms of contributing to the mitigation effort. But beyond that, it's about talking to our customers. We have quite a big reach to people who buy products from us, right? Oil, gas. It's talking to them and working with them to see how they transform, move away from fossil fuel molecules to low carbon electrons and molecules. And so because that needs to happen in parallel. And then the third pillar here is talking to governments, because policy, you mentioned, is a key sort of enabler of this, but also in terms of getting infrastructure built. Scaling up in just 30 years, transforming the energy system is quite a task. So you need the infrastructure to be building out at the same time. So I think that's how we see the mitigation, our responsibilities and our roles. So it's both direct and indirect. I mean, it's interesting, the adaptation made me think of it, coming on this panel. But we have assets in all sorts of geographies across the world. And it is an issue for us to think about how do you make those assets resilient to climate change? And how do you make those assets also lower emitting? And that means we work with a lot of local communities in those areas to ensure that our assets are secure, and so is sort of the community. The livelihoods, et cetera, are also made secure. So again, that's a really important part of the agenda that doesn't get as much sort of play, if you like. But I think that is, given how big and vast our operations are, there is quite a bit on the resilience space that we do with communities. So I'll stop there, and happy to pick any of this up.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting insights. And I think this outset of the understanding that the Sustainable Development Goals are only to be achieved if we keep a stable Earth system. I think it's crucial for the driving of this conversation, and also the parallelity of challenges that you have mentioned. And because there have been delays in both taking climate action and combating hunger, achieving some of those development goals, we have come to the realization that we could have been, despite the development gains that were made, we could have been further today than we are today. So I think this realization is also important when looking forward as to accelerating this transition and also the achievement of the development goals. I would like to turn to Mr. Bhattacharya. You have played a crucial role in the independent high-level expert group of the COP26, COP27, the international climate negotiations, and have published a report on this. But I would like to hear from this experience of this independent high-level expert groups. How do you see the coming together of the challenges, both mitigation, adaptation, and the financing issues around those?
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here. So we did this work together with Vera Songwe, who's not here, and with Nick Stern. So maybe I should get twice the amount of time since Vera passed her messages to me, but I'll be brief. So let me begin with 4 propositions. First is the centrality of the development challenge, which is actually the backdrop of what we are facing. We are off track on virtually every SDG at this point in time. And in the next 3 decades, we will add 2 billion to the planet, all in the developing world other than China. Okay? So the development challenge is as large, as urgent as the climate challenge. First proposition. Second proposition is developing countries, as Anand said, are disproportionately hit by climate change, and it's a survivability issue. Third, developing countries will account for the bulk of incremental emissions of the future. By 2030, they will account for more than 50% of global emissions. So if we don't succeed on mitigation in the developing world, we will not succeed on adaptation in the developing world. And the fourth point I want to make is actually this transformation is a tremendous opportunity. Nick Stern and I call it the growth opportunity of the 21st century. Why? Because actually there's possibility of having your cake and eating it too. You can produce energy, which is the lifeblood of development, at a much lower cost than we could. Imagine a world where the marginal cost of energy approaches zero. India spends almost 20% of its income a year on fossil fuels. Think about the capital value of that if you didn't have to spend that money. Second, think about all the co-benefits that come with climate action. Less pollution, more innovation. So the answer to this right now is we need a massive scale-up of investment and innovation in a way that we haven't seen for the last 75 years. And the world has to come together around how that investment can materialize, how we ensure that it's high quality, and how do we finance it. So from the perspective of the developing world, what does that mean? It basically means cost of capital, cost of capital, cost of capital. We need affordable finance for the developing world to finance this transition. We've done analysis, for example, of what is the cost of solar power, the big push here. If you look at solar power for the top tiers, it's okay, the pricing is all right. But if you compare, for example, the financing of solar power in Africa with that in Germany, there is just no way that you can finance solar power in Africa without tackling the cost of capital. Finally, in terms of numbers. So we keep talking about the famous 100 billion, that we only delivered 80 billion, but very frankly, that 100 billion is irrelevant. And let me explain why. In order to make the transition that we are talking about, emerging markets and developing countries other than China will need to spend about $2.5 trillion per year by 2030 for the 3 transformations: energy transformation, loss and damage and adaptation and resilience, and reversing the degradation of natural capital and biodiversity. Of that, we argue that $1 trillion a year must come from external finance. Now, that's not aid, that's not charity. So, where is that finance going to come from? From three sources. First, a massive scale up of the multilateral development finance system, which frankly has been operating at the boundaries of irrelevance in the terms of financing. Second, we need to create a new highway for private finance. Every year, the pool of global financial assets that are long term and that should be invested in the space keeps increasing. Right now, it's $400 trillion. How much of that is invested in green transformation projects in the developing world? Zero. So making this new highway for private finance is the second. And the third is we will need significant amount of concessional finance for the just transitions, for adaptation and resilience, for loss and damage, and for risk capital. Where is that going to come from? I think we will be waiting for Godot if we think it's going to come from donors. So we are therefore arguing that we need to be much more innovative and creative in unlocking concessional finance at scale. Think about use of SDRs. Think about voluntary and compliant carbon markets. Think about innovative structures like the International Financing Facility for Education. So expanding these three pools, development finance, private finance, and concessional finance together will be very important, but all on the basis of solid policy and institutional commitment by countries.
Thank you for also setting again the global scene for this challenge and for highlighting the opportunities also of this transition. I think this is very important, even though we are facing multiple crises, to always also see the opportunities that are present in the moment and that we need to grasp in order to be able to solve the ongoing crisis. I would like to turn back to you, Mr. Nageswaran, and ask you, we've heard this opportunities for green growth, but can financial commitments to climate action be enhanced without cannibalizing other development priorities? We have come to a kind of an agreement that development needs climate stability, biodiversity, richness, but the question of the finance is still, I think, a crucial one.
I don't know if the food is spicy or not, but let's add some spice to the evening. Okay. Amar spoke about the fact that 50% of the incremental emissions would come from developing countries, and therefore mitigation ought to be the priority. I just want to throw the question back. Given that resources are finite, for developing countries, should mitigation be the priority or adaptation should be the priority? Because there is a stock of carbon that's already out there in the environment coming from 200, 250 years of emission. So we do not know with any degree of certainty that no matter whatever actions that you take today to bring the global warming to 1.5 or even or 2 or whatever, how much of that incremental contribution it would make to climate change when there is such a stock of carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases that are already out there. And given that resources are finite, and given that donor money is not going to be possible, as he's saying, and private capital, we do not know exactly, and Amar mentioned cost of capital thrice. We do not know at what cost would it come, etc. And economics is all about trade-offs. So what should they be focusing on? Should it be on adaptation first or mitigation? Because adaptation is key, because right now already the carbon out there is creating so many problems and challenges for small island states, ocean-based states, and other developing countries as well. And in general, growth is what creates resources for countries. And also it is true for companies. Internal resource generation is the primary source of funding for corporates, and it is no exception for countries as well. I just would like to quote Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling, who got the Nobel in 2005. And he wrote in the American Economic Review in March 1992, quote, if per capita income growth in the next 40 years compares with the 40 years just past, vulnerability to climate change should diminish and the resources available for adaptation should be greater. I say this not to minimize concern about climate change, but to anticipate the question of whether developing countries should make sacrifices in their development to minimize the emission of gases that may change climate to their disadvantage. In fact, their best defense against climate change may be their own continued development. This is a point worth emphasizing, he's saying. Some environmentalists argue that developing countries should sacrifice some of their hopes for economic development in the interest of slowing the climate change that may prove disastrous. But the advice contains a contradiction. Any disaster to developing countries from climate change will be a disaster to their economic development. What is desired is to optimize development by investing in greenhouse gas abatement only when that appears, subject to all uncertainties, only when that appears to contribute more to their development in the future than the alternative direct investment in development. Therefore, it is not economic growth versus development, it is growth with the environment taken into account, unquote. So I think I have hopefully thrown several balls in the air for my other panelists to pick up. Thank you.
I think Mallika will rise to the challenge. And yeah, I think this is a hot discussion. We are faced with a very limited carbon budget under the Paris Agreement, and it requires swift action, especially from industrialized countries, but it also has limited the space for fossil-based industrialization in other countries. Please come in.
Yes, so in the interest of adding some more spice to all of this discussion, so I think that's right. So we do a lot of analysis at Shell in terms of our long-term scenarios, looking at carbon budget and how are we on track, are we not? And really sort of what stands out is that in this coming decade, there could be years in which we breach 1.5. And so that's like quite a wake-up call and quite a shocking fact to internalize. And I think that means there is a certain amount of climate change that's locked in. And that's what, and mitigation, resilience and adaptation to that is absolutely essential. I mean, that is just, we have to deal with the consequences of that. It disproportionately affects less developed countries. So I think there shouldn't be any debate about how the fact that you need to adapt. But now to add the spicy bit to it, I would say that actually mitigation going forward is the cheaper economic option than continuing to adapt. So I think going forward, taking action, and even though people talk about the cost of mitigation today, it is going to be a fraction of the cost that you're going to have on the economy through economic losses. Forget the displacement of society. I mean, these are just pure economic losses from having a climate change Earth continue to warm. So in some sense, that we have to deal with what's locked in. But in terms of going forward, you have to think of the cost of mitigation in the context of what if you didn't do that, and what is the cost of then adapting, if you can even, down the line to that. So I think so that's sort of the logic that at least we apply in thinking about this, and sort of separating these two issues in ways that complement each other and don't sort of say is it adaptation or mitigation. I think there's the clear need for both, and there's a clear principle on which you can do both of those.
Yeah, a clear principle, and I think that is tied to the Paris Agreement that has the upper boundary of 2 degrees warming limit, above which adaptation options will technically and financially also quickly diminish. So I think this limits of adaptation, even if we have an increase in per capita development and growth, is also something to keep in mind in this discussion. Natalie, I saw you taking a lot of notes on this, and I wanted to turn to you again, also regarding how to also bring countries along the table that are not only consumers of fossil fuels but also producers of fossil fuels. How can the incentivization work? Should there be an incentivization? What is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really a crucial question, because it ties into also a point that I was making earlier about the losers. Of course, producing countries are potential losers from this transformation, and so the question is how to compensate them. Now, I'm kind of less worried about very wealthy producing countries. I don't kind of lose sleep over the Norway or even, the UAE. I mean, these are countries that will be able to fund and get through their own transition. I'm worried more about the Algerias, the Nigerias of this world, and how is it that we're going to deal with those? I'm sort of, and I've been thinking a lot about this question, especially as, against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, as Europe has been trying to wean itself off from Russian gas, it has actually been looking out to many of these countries. So here we are saying to Algeria, we want to buy more of your gas, but then at the same time we're saying, hey, and by the way, in 15, 20 years, that's it, it's game over, right? And these are countries that depend heavily, essentially, on their fossil exports to Europe. So how to square this circle? I mean, initially I was kind of very, I really thought that there was a contradiction here, and a kind of, an unresolvable contradiction. And then I guess in a very Hegelian way, I've managed to resolve it in actually looking at empirically what has been happening. So let's take the Algeria case, because I think it's quite an interesting one. And I guess I pick it as an Italian. Here we are. We've been looking to solve our Russia problem mainly, actually, through Algeria. And there's been a lot of gas investment there. But the quid pro quo for that investment, I mean, mind you, that investment would have happened probably anyway. The real point was that was gas that would have been sold to local markets. And now what we're saying is, can we please sell it to ourselves? Now, what are you going to give in return? Well, actually, what is being given in return is a whole load of new investments on energy efficiency, on renewables, on carbon capture and storage. And so I think, within this example, there is in it the potential of basically saying, whether it's public institutions or private ones, what is the potential of progressively greening these relationships when it comes to those producing countries that would otherwise risk being on the loser side of the transition story?
Thanks. And I think it's very important to foster this understanding of very different situations for different hydrocarbon exporters. So I think this is a key point in addressing the challenge. I would like to turn back to Mr. Bhattacharya and ask you, you have made a strong point on the highway for private investment, for really trying to unleash larger amounts of investment. How can this be synergized, though, with public investments, with institutional, multilateral, and philanthropic investments? And how can we ensure that it reaches, especially when we think about adaptation, also those who are most in need of being protected from the threats of climate change?
Thank you. So just to first carry on the conversation, no spice level, just some sugar. So I'd say that let's not set development and climate, adaptation and mitigation as artificial horse races, one with the other. So actually, I totally agree with Anand that, the most urgent priority right now for the developing world is dealing with immediate loss and damage. We don't have those arrangements in place. Second, the faster we act on adaptation and resilience, the less will be future loss and damage. And we are massively underinvesting in adaptation and resilience. And the third is that very much as India is trying to do, use energy transformation to both deliver on development and climate. So set it up like that, then you don't have so much confrontation. The challenge does remain, as you say, where is this financing going to come from? And as I argue, one kind of aspect of it, given the public a point that I keep now emphasizing is scaling up affordable finance. Because if the finance is too costly, then instead of being a solution, it becomes a problem. And so development finance, is a way to do that in a very efficient way. If I were to put $9 billion, I can double the capital of the World Bank, the most efficient form of public finance known in the world. But politically, we do not find the means to do it. So that's something people need to understand. Why are we failing in this in very simple solution? Second, on the private side of it, there are really, in some sense, three parts. One is, how do you create the conditions to remove impediments to private investment? Okay? And that means risk, exchange rate risk, policy-induced risk like offtake risk, aggregation, credit risk. And we know structures that we can deal with it, but we need it on a replicable, scalable way. I'm working very closely, for example, with the Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero, and we're thinking about what kinds of structures can we put in place so that actually we can go to scale. And the third is we won't be able to do all of this without the lubrication of concessional finance. At the moment, the concessional finance that is provided under $100 billion is about $30 billion. In our view, it needs to be 6-7 times that. And, so we're not going to get that from this pot. So we need to find. So it's really bringing these financing together in a way that recognizes their complementary strengths and that is synergistic, that has to happen. And that's the central message in the report that Vera and I were involved in.
Thanks for sharing these insights. I mean, I heard some of this also reflected in some of the first interventions in the session that we just came from, the inaugural session. And that brings to the broader question of the Bretton Woods system being fit for addressing the pressing challenges, such as the climate crisis, but it ties also into other crises. Mr. Nageswaran, you would like to comment on this?
Thank you, Kira. I think, in macroeconomic terms, we know that economic growth generates income, which in turn generates savings, which goes to finance investment. Suppose countries are not able to grow and therefore they don't have the resource to do these investments on their own. If you're going to depend on external sources of funding, whether it is public or private, concessional or non-concessional, then through the macroeconomic identity, which means you have to run a unsustainably large current account deficit to be able to attract this funding. I mean, because external dis-savings is equal to the internal dis-saving. That's identity. So if the scale of resources required is so humongous for every country, how are they going to be able to run a current account deficit of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of GDP? Who will finance it? And second, at what cost will they be financed? Because we now know, for example, when countries accumulate external liabilities, whether it is in their own currency to non-residents or in foreign currency, at some point, when developed countries, central banks tighten monetary policy, etc., you have spillovers and consequences, and a neighboring developing country which had a middle income status is on the verge of becoming a lower income country. So how will the financial markets respond to this? How will they understand that these countries should be allowed under the safe threshold of current account deficit should no longer be 2% or 3%, but should be 7 or 8%? So what is the answer to these questions? And he also mentioned about exchange rates. And many countries have seen in recent times their foreign currency liabilities balloon to unsustainable levels simply because their currencies lost so much of value against the US dollar, etc. How are we going to manage that? So should we then put in place these mechanisms before we talk about raising funding from overseas sources? If we say that in the long run, development and climate change should not be posited as alternatives or trade-offs, I have to tell you that in the last 1 year or so, Dr. John Pisani-Ferry of the Bruegel Institute has started to worry about the short-run macroeconomic cost of energy and climate transition. And the problem is that he says this short run will not be necessarily short run as we understand as 3 or 6 months or 12 months or 2 years. It could last as long as 5 to 10 years. And in that period, if growth is going to be sacrificed, then how far will the public and households be willing to take the sacrifices required for these changes? I think there are far too many elephants in the room, and we are not recognizing them. Thank you.
Mallika, what are, in your viewpoint, the financial risks that come with the transition to renewables, and how can these risks be reduced without compromising on climate targets? And maybe adding to this also the question, is it de-risking some of the investments? Is it, if you could make a wish list to governments for Shell to become more sustainable even, what would this wish list contain?
So yes, so I think, fundamentally, a lot of these technologies are not commercial yet, right? I mean, so they don't, compared to fossil fuel, for example, it's getting there, but renewable generation on a system-wide basis is not yet cost competitive. And that is fundamentally the issue with, if you are a private sector company going into that. And that's where you need the government policy interventions. And, the UK does very good one with the auctions around renewables, and that gives you the kinds of policy support to get investment in, and then presumably, and what we've seen, drive down costs. We've seen the cost really go through the floor on solar, on wind, on batteries, and at the same time you're learning, zooming up the learning curve on these technologies in terms of how to get them to work and meet the needs. So I think that's one fundamental area where policy right now is crucial. I don't, as an economist, I think these costs will come down. It will reach cost competitiveness. So this is not forever that you need, but you need the policy support to get that momentum and those costs down now. So I think that's the first financial risk that we see. The second is that the nature of energy is changing. If you supply electricity from renewables, it's very different from supplying electricity from fossils, because firstly, renewables are intermittent, depending on when they're available. Secondly, they're not necessarily, you can't locate them next to where your demand centers are. So you need to then move them around the electricity. So the nature of it is quite different. So it requires different business models and for companies to think through what are those different models, what are the products you can offer in the low carbon energy space, and what are the business models that will then support it. So I think it's a moment of experimentation around these to figure out where is it, how do you get onto a financially sort of stable framework that will drive some more of that investment. I think the role of policy is absolutely sort of fundamental. If I had a wish list, I would say policy certainty. That is absolutely critical. I mean, we're seeing a lot. I think we understand as Shell that the energy transition will look different in different countries. It's not going to be exactly the same. And so different countries will have different policies that prioritize certain approaches, etc. That's fine. But it's just having the certainty of those approaches persisting over 10 years, 15 years. Because that's the time frame over which you're doing these investments, energy investments. So I think that, to me, that would be the plea here, at least to have a consistent approach that you stand by until these technologies commercialize. And then the market will take over and it will drive the deployment. The other sort of plea that I would have is infrastructure. We're really thinking a lot around infrastructure and how do you get that built out. And fundamentally, infrastructure is in many countries is a government issue, or is government involvement in that issue. They're either natural monopolies or they're actually publicly owned. So there's a lot of sort of interface with government regulations around that. So building that out is absolutely crucial. Because that means you can scale up energy supply, energy demand. If you can move the things around, you can scale it up a lot quicker than waiting around for the infrastructure to develop. And so I think that's the other plea, that governments sort of think hard about how do you develop that infrastructure. And then it brings in a lot of the areas around finance. A lot of this could be through concessional financing, through other sources that would hit both the development agenda as well as the climate agenda. I'll stop there.
Natalie, policy certainty in areas of geopolitical crises. Is this a possibility? I mean, 10, 15 years from a climate science perspective is very short. So, but in terms of political perspective, where many political systems change 3, 4, 5 years, it's quite long. So, what is your take on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, the truth of the matter is that many of the methods, the methodologies that we developed, in a sense, belong to a different era. And now it's been one crisis after the next, and we still think of it in terms of being a crisis, and then there will be a return to normal. And our methods have not adapted to the fact that this is the new normal, right? We don't know when the next pandemic is going to break out, but we have a fair degree of certainty about the fact that it will, as much as the fact that we're not preparing for it, right? And so on for other issues, including war, right? So, I think there's a question of, whether we're looking at it from a private sort of perspective as well as from a public perspective. I think there's really something to be said about how we go about risk and predictability, and how our models, in a sense, have really been built for a different era. I mean, I think, the point that Mallika was making about predictability is obviously hugely important, but in a sense, almost impossible, because in a sense, we are on this journey to an extent into an unknown. And much as, I really I picked up on, Mallika, when you said, a lot of it is about experimentation with new models. And in a sense, there's also experimentation in policy. We don't really know what is, in a sense, the policy mixes that will work. We can know it in theory, but hey, here we are in Europe. We thought that we had a policy mix that was basically a mix of carbon pricing and regulation and funding. Then comes the Inflation Reduction Act, and all of a sudden we realized that, we actually don't have an industrial policy. So in a sense, it's all of those exogenous factors that also inevitably have to make you rethink about your own policy mixes. So I guess it's not a particularly optimistic way to kind of end these remarks. But I think, coming back to the starting point of these last reflections, I think we really have to rethink quite hard the methods that we apply to even think about these things.
Yeah, optimism is not so easy to come by. I guess it has to be fought for through hope and through concrete steps towards an improved future, at least. Amar, I would like to ask you, from your work with this independent high-level expert group, and also coming from a country that is struggling with its coal exit, are there any best practices that you have come across, that you have discussed in terms of policy making, that you could share with us?
No, I think this is an area which is still work in progress. We know from the experience of Germany that exit from coal is not an easy issue, even in an advanced country. And certainly I would argue that it's a complicated issue in the emerging market and developing world. China is sui generis. They have something like 1,200 coal-fired power plants. To get rid of that is going to be a big issue for China. We feel they have the means to do it, but apart from getting rid of them, they're still building quite a few new ones. So that's a challenge which China will have to confront. If you look at India, we have the same number of coal-fired power plants as the United States, but ours is a lot younger. So when you have to get rid of them, somebody will have to take a financial hit if you want to get rid of it early. Getting rid of coal-fired power plants has quite a lot of costs associated with decommissioning. And, remember, we have more than 1 million people, very poor people in the coal economy in this country. So the issue of just transition becomes very, very paramount importance. And if the world says there's a global public good because India or Indonesia or South Africa or Vietnam should exit out of coal, we need, in some sense, some burden sharing on that. Otherwise, it's not really a fair proposition. But the win-win proposition and the one which connects, everything, which is the growth opportunity, is the massive scale up of renewables at this point in time. So the approach that India is taking is exactly right, which is, we will base our transformation on a very massive scale up of renewables. And in order for that, the kind of policy and finance piece has to fall into place.
A just transition, a big word that calls for the question also, justice for whom? No? And I wanted to turn to Mr. Nageswaran again. India also being a very young country, it also, these questions about financing now and investing now also draw upon questions of intergenerational justice. Is this something that is considered when making these big economic decisions at the moment?
Absolutely, it is a very valid question to raise. In fact, I really like the fact that Natalie acknowledged that this was not a most optimistic way to conclude. I think what we need is less optimism and more realism in the entire climate discourse. Now, when you talk of intergenerational justice or etc., in the just transition, the idea is that when you make people when you want to wean people away from fossil fuel industry, whether they are producers or consumers, you make sure that nobody is left worse off, right? But think about the idea of relocating workers from fossil fuel industries to green industry. It's easier said than done. I mean, in a report, a multilateral institution can simply write that workers should be retrained and relocated to energy-saving industries, renewable industries, and green energy industries. That probably takes about 30 seconds to write or type. But it takes more than 30 years for this to happen. And most of us sitting in this room are probably footloose globalized citizens, and we wouldn't worry about relocating from one city to the other and fit in very easily within the next 1 month or so. But many people do have roots, cultures, and their ecosystem that they are used to, and asking them to move from one to the other and then get retrained, it's not easy. I think what is important is that in many of these discourses, whether it is dealing with the global pandemic or whether it is global with global climate challenges, we should start by acknowledging the reality, acknowledging the truths, telling people the truth, and also telling people that decisions involve trade-offs and resources have competing uses, and we need to prioritize, and we need to be honest about many things. I mean, I'll just give you one more example. This whole idea of disclosure standards. Now, conceptually, it is right that there should be enough disclosure by all people looking for money, and it should be uniform so that financial resource providers will be able to take this information at face value and provide resources. But we know that pension funds and multilateral and some financial institutions in developed countries have left some of these Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero, etc., because they simply couldn't spend the resources required to even provide this information. The information requirements are so onerous that some of the developed country financial institutions have left these alliances because they said we can't afford to generate this information. Now imagine the plight of micro, medium, and small enterprises in many low-income countries. So are we really going to come up with disclosure standards that recognize this proportionality? Will we give them more time? Will we give them more support? And what kind of information will we ask for from them? If we don't, then they will be categorized as people who do not have transparency, etc. And you will be blocking the very funding that they need to become transparent and become more advanced. We are not debating real issues here at all.
Thanks for spicing it up one more time before the main course starts. I think part of the truth is also that we will reach the 1.5 degree limit over the coming years. And that means before we stabilize the climate, extreme weather events that we're currently witnessing are going to get worse. So the need for adaptation will definitely rise over the coming years. I would now like to take the opportunity to invite you to ask your questions to the panel. And I already see some hands up. Just please introduce yourself briefly with name and institution, and then make a concise statement or question.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Tanya Singh. I represent the global engagement team for KPMG for CX. Interestingly, and so I deal with a lot of consumerism as such over the world. The second role that I have is I work as a judge for the United Nations Hull Prize competition in Boston, USA, wherein my agenda or intention is to teach young people to build sustainable business models. And be balanced about it. My question essentially is, and anyone can take it, though I would like Mallika and Mr. Kameshwaram to answer that. And I want to reflect on game theory. And if we analyze this problem according to the game theory, what is the finite resource? What is the infinite resource when we speak about energy transitions and people consuming that energy? And what would be that win-win scenario? I'll tell you the reason why I'm asking this question is because if you think about perfect competition markets, right? Demands are being met by 2 or 3 incumbents or players. Incidentally, the Russia war was it was something that was not precedented, right? So now you have one player removed, which means the rules have changed, and we were assuming that all players playing this game are rational, which was not what happened. So now on the other side of this, how do we evaluate that problem really from a historical perspective, knowing very well that game theory plays out in 4 outcomes?
Thanks. I would like to take 1 or 2 more questions before we go to back to the panel, please.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. I have 2 questions. The first one is with respect to energy transition. Now, since we heard just transition and all these things, I am bothering inside me that we have increased, at least in India, by the way, let me introduce myself, Dr. Priyadarshi Das from Research and Information System for Developing Countries. I'm also part of Task Force 5 of T20. We have successfully increased the solar content in the renewable energy production in India. But I'm wondering, no house owner who buys a new house or who goes for constructing a new house demands from the builder that I want renewable energy solution at my house. I don't want conventional energy. Make the structure such a way that I have solar energy, I have some rainwater harvesting. Nobody demands. My point, what I'm referring to, the household adoption of the energy transition that we are talking about. One is the public supplier who says that we increase the production of renewable energy which is available for you to consume. But I, as a consumer, am I aware enough that I demand that the energy that I consume at home is made of renewable energy? I don't see that is happening in my neighborhood or anywhere. Well, I don't know if this is a silly question or not, but unless household adoption of the energy transition that we are talking about, we keep on talking energy transition for next 2-3 decades, even though the solar component or wind component increases in the energy mix.
Okay, thank you.
Second, one more question.
Sorry. I think we have to take one more question.
Okay,
but thank you. I think the consumer perspective was missing still in our discussion. So thank you very much for adding this.
My name is Matthew Asada. I'm a diplomat with the U.S. Department of State, but I'm currently assigned to the University of Southern California and the Center on Public Diplomacy. And my question actually is follow on to this about, again, the role of the individual. And what would the panel here advise needs to change about the reporting in journalism that's being done about climate change and this transition? When we look at the COP27, when we look at COP28, there's a lot of expectations for these events, a lot of people gathering together, but it's unclear to the public whether they're a success or not. Is this something that just continues year after year after year? But if we can talk a little bit about public messaging and the reporting by mainstream press on the event and on the industry. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Yeah, importantly, I think this is also very diverse across countries, how climate is reported in different medias. So we have a wealth of questions. We have how the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has shifted outcomes of possible previews of conflict predictors. Also on climate change, how does this undermine this? What role does game theory play? What are finite, infinite resources? The role of the individual consumer, and also the question of media. Who would like to start? Would you like to start?
On the first question by Tanya.
Please, yeah.
I'm not entirely sure I understood your question, but if my answer doesn't respond to your question properly, please do feel free to tell me. I think I would like to believe that at the margin, the ongoing conflict, the war in Ukraine, has probably sensitized many developing countries to the fact that, yes, they do need to diversify their energy sources. Because of not only the price volatility that we experienced in 2022, but also the supply disruptions and concerns that it has generated. But that's only one part of the equation. For it to have a lasting effect, I think the following two questions, especially the gentleman's point about how sensitive are households to their own energy emission, etc. And I think that is where we need more nudge towards household behavior change. And there, I think in her initial remarks, Natalie did point out, or I think it was Kira who mentioned, I don't remember, my apologies, about remembering the yellow vest of France in 2019. And that was a response to carbon pricing. And OECD came up with a report last year called Household Attitudes to Carbon Pricing in G20 countries. So they took a survey of 2,000 people in every country, total 40,000 respondents, well represented across ages, income categories, sexes, etc. And what came out was that, by and large, many households in advanced countries were resistant to making changes to their eating habits, driving habits, and flying habits to be able to moderate their consumption or shift them towards. So I'm not sure a game theoretic perspective will be useful, although it is useful for modeling short-run policy responses in this context. But what we need is not only at the governmental level a policy response, but also at the household level. And that is not going to come about in a short time frame. So sorry if I didn't really answer your question. Yeah.
No, thanks. I think this already gave a great entry point for the discussion around these different questions. Just adding to the yellow vests, I mean, I'm personally a bit more concerned about the youth protests in Germany of people gluing themselves to streets to ask for more climate protection. But of course, we see a polarization maybe in both directions. Mallika, you wanted to jump in also on the first question.
Yeah, because it was directed at us here. So I think, so again, I would recast it. I see what you're getting at with the game theoretic perspective. And I think for us, how we're viewing it, and we will be publishing our new scenarios on March 21st. It is a movement away from sort of like a collaborative and a global compact to decarbonize, which is what we've seen through the last 10 years. That the world comes together, it's the right thing to do, and we do it together. We're seeing that after Ukraine, even after the pandemic, there's a fragmentation of the global order, if you like. There isn't this sort of overarching, sort of uniting principle. And I think that will affect how action is taken on climate. And it moves you into the space of a bit more of game theory. So we have a tool that we think about where we divided the world into archetypes. And based on certain classification of their vulnerability to energy price volatility and the ability to have domestic resources to meet. And it is interesting because at first glance, when you look at that, it's quite a depressing story on the climate issue. Because you don't have that global coordination that we always built in to these reports that say everyone sort of gets together, holds hands, and solves the problem. But there are ways in which, and when you start thinking about this fragmented world, there are ways that we see pockets of accelerated action happening in some of the fragments, if you like, and so there is still a route through in this sort of more game theoretic, tactical world to get to an outcome that could be similar to Paris. But equally, there's a danger that if you don't, that you will just, the fragmenting will just drive you further and further away from that goal. So I think it's a really interesting, and I'm happy to pick this up with you after this. But this is something we've been thinking a lot about currently.
Amar, I wanted to ask you, since you also work for Brookings, you publish in a variety of outlets. How do you see these inputs that you give being received by the media, and how do you think this should be improved?
Thank you, Kira. But if I also could just add a word on the very important point that individual behavior is going to be very important, both as an inertial force. I live in America where, we tend to be fixed in our ways of consumption, and also the opportunities that were talked about. And I think one very, very important initiative under the Indian G20 presidency is this lifestyle for the environment, which Prime Minister Modi has put on the table. And, the theory of it at one level is very simple, which is if you inform individuals, if you empower individuals and you give them information, they can be very powerful agents of change. And that in turn can be reinforced by communities, businesses, and government policy. So India has a very, very good kind of initiative there, I think. It's not going to something you'll solve in 1 year, but it's actually a movement, a campaign. And I certainly personally sign on to that very, very fully. Second, in this business, we are at a very, kind of divisive world in terms of interpretation. There are people who will say, who will basically be arguing climate over everything else, and then there are climate deniers. And when you look at the media, it's very difficult actually to draw a balanced perspective. So I think it's important to have objectivity, fact, and analysis drive decision making. Media has clear responsibility on that. As far as the COPs are concerned, the COP26, COP27, COP28, they have become essentially nodal points where the negotiating room and the negotiating space is less relevant than in some sense the galvanizing of stakeholders from outside. I think that personally that's a good thing to have civil society, business, a financial sector playing a much, much more important role in the COP processes rather than the contentious stalemates of the negotiators. So I think there's a change happening, which we should, but I know coming back to what Anand said, we have to be living in a world of realism. We have to say, what are the practical solutions? And I will come back to my central point, which is, whether you look at energy security or you look at energy affordability, the biggest strain on which to get on right now for the developing world is the renewable train, but it means tackling some of the kinds of constraints that Anand was talking about, the supply chain constraints. Where is the employment going to come from? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? So I would say that ultimately this is really for each country to come up with, and for the international community then to be able to provide predictable, scaled-up support. So I am all for not kind of broad brush statements, but now saying let's have transition programs, adaptation programs, and development programs that are really country-based, country-led, and country-driven.
Natalie, you wanted to come in briefly before we open again for some more questions.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps just a couple of remarks. I mean, the first is on, the question of, how has Russia's invasion changed the equation here beyond the war itself? And I think it has done so in at least three ways. I think the first aspect is we now know that politics, security on the one hand, and economics on the other are not detached. I mean, there isn't a world in which, there are conflicts, there are wars, there are political tensions, but business is business. Business is not business. It is conditioned by everything else. And what is understood from a material perspective as an irrational behavior is not irrational if you start from a different rationality, right? Because these things are interlinked. And as I said, this is something that applies to, it's a lesson learned from this particular war, but I think it has greater applicability elsewhere. The second, and in a sense we've talked about it, is really this question of interdependence, and interdependence being both a source of peace, love, and happiness, but also a source of insecurity. And we've seen it in the case of fossil interdependencies, but as was already being discussed, there is obviously the critical minerals issue looming. And then the sort of third aspect is the way in which energy security and the energy transition interlock. And I guess, I ended earlier with a more pessimistic note. This is actually a more optimistic note in the sense that at the beginning of this war, we actually thought there was a contradiction between the two. Spending in the urgency of now so much money on basically gas hoarding left, right, and center would have meant slowing down the energy transition. It has not been the case. And that, I think, is actually an incredibly optimistic point to end.
Thank you for this honest optimism. I would like to again ask you if you... Yeah, please feel free now. I turn back to the audience.
Declaration.
The lady in the back, please move to a microphone and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Julie Revere. I'm the country director for GIZ here in India, and I've been living in India for 5.5 years. My question is the following. I have been following, of course, the debate on JET, on energy transition, because we have lots and lots of projects related to this in one way or another. What I miss in the whole discourse is a very low-hanging fruit, and that is 1 million Indians getting onto the job market every month, and they're not trained. So if I want to have an energy transition, I need to have skilled workers. I need to have skilled workers in green skills. And this discourse is not really very prominent. We are talking about the things that I heard now from you, but we are not really talking about the low-hanging fruits, because if these people are not being dealt with, there is going to be a next challenge that needs to be dealt with. To just give you a reality check, for instance, solar panels, there are programs around, and they don't even fill the seats that they have. There are no girls to be found. There are not even enough boys that want to work in solar panel installation, whatever. So if you don't have the manpower to do everything you want to do to green the economy, people are simply not there. And that discourse, I'm not hearing really anywhere. And like I said, I'm here, I'm listening, and it's such a low-hanging fruit, which doesn't cost that much money, because India has these missions. They're the right missions, so they're doing a really good job, but people cannot even access the money to really implement those missions because the capacities aren't there. So I would like to hear a little bit more about thoughts, how we could move forward there. Shell and other businesses that are around, but also maybe the ministries, because it is something that is just there and just needs to be tapped into. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate also bringing in the gender dimension into this, the manpower, the woman power, to really stem this transition. I think it can also be tied to the question of how to finance not only infrastructure, but also training, capacity building that is needed to implement these innovations and also accelerate them.
Can I?
Yes, briefly, please.
Yeah. Not on household adoption, something else. So I think I just do not want to make a fun of the things, but the private sector participation that we are thinking should be forthcoming in infrastructure finance, in general, in economy. In India, at least, private sector used to blame that a lot of government controls are there. We are not able to invest in sectors. Now, so many years, decades have passed. Our government is open for private investment and everything. Why is that private sector is not learning? Some of these things Dr. Bhattacharya mentioned that perhaps could be the reasons for private sector anticipating a very high risk perception in certain infrastructure sectors. But is the private sector not learning with the government as well? So adaptation of the private sector itself to the governments in developing countries, I believe that is something which is more practical. At some point of time, we are requiring state guarantee. That if state gives the guarantee, we are willing to invest. Governments did that across the world. But now that we are in a globalized world, why the institutional investors are not investing? Pension funds, then you have sovereign wealth funds. They are sitting with huge money. How would they be motivated? I don't know whether it's a silly question or not. When will they get convinced that the economy can pay back them the return if they invest in the infrastructure projects? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mallika, I would like to turn to you again regarding this. Also questioning also this, open up the question on financing less traditional forms of adaptation, so more on the capacity building side, but also the question, what is the role of the private sector in this, in training, in also tailoring more to the needs of developing countries? Can you give an input on this?
Sure. So I mean, I'll pick up both the questions, Kira, if that's an elements of it, and others can jump in. So I think on the skills, yes, I think this is something that increasingly you're seeing a bottleneck emerge in terms of the skills you need in these low carbon industries, and they're not necessarily as easy as Anantha was saying, that you can just take the people who are losing out from this and put them into those kind of jobs. It is an issue, and I think we're seeing some of that change happening and panning out through what you see in labor markets in the West today. So all the shortages in the current kind of jobs and people looking for better aspirational jobs. And so I think that's an issue that needs to be resolved. It's not just government, it's also businesses need to sort of start focusing on that. I think it will, it's slowly turning, but it takes time. On the gender question, I think, it's not a question of low carbon. I think women need to be given skills in general to participate in the labor markets. And so I would heartily agree with the comment, and not just limit it to low carbon. I think you're missing a huge productivity trick if you don't bring women into the labor force. So right there, I think that's one thing. Now, in terms of the environment for investment, and I think that, it's a complex, global financial flows are really complex, and probably Amar or someone would be able to speak to this better than I can. But in terms of, it's just about the confluence of what is the business opportunity that a company like Shell is looking for, and where is it that it can do that best. So it's that relative sort of judging based on what is it that we're looking for. So I think, but with the energy transition, we realize that energy is getting more and more disaggregated. So it's not just global gas or oil that moves around. Electricity is very much local. And so we're now looking to see how do you invest in the countries and to provide the energy needs of that country, because we are seeing more and more of that localization. So it is something that's on the radar. And again, I think we're moving in more and more geographies to make those investments. But again, it's a business decision in terms of what opportunities are we seeking and where is it best for us to do that.
Yeah, please come in.
No, I think I take it that it was more of a statement other than a question about skilling, and I agree with the importance of it. It is not just that we need to prepare our youth looking for jobs with respect to addressing and use it as an opportunity to also to address some of the climate challenges, etc. We have quite a few 21st century challenges which we need to prepare our youth for, including mental health challenges, elder care, etc. And climate is also one of them. So I agree that the emphasis on skilling in India also has to start addressing to some extent the budget of 23-24 presented in early February, does go to some length in thinking about these issues, because it talks about the importance of providing opening 150 nursing colleges, etc. And it has also addressed a skilling initiative 2.0 or 4.0, which will talk about artificial intelligence, etc. But I agree with her that many more such development challenges which are relevant for 21st century, including green transition, mental health challenges, elder care, all have to become part of our skilling initiatives. So to that extent, I agree with that.
Thanks. I will take another round of questions right now. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. My name is Christy Su. I'm from Taiwan doing economic research. I have a question regarding the 12 countries forming an agreement for critical materials or critical minerals. So according to the WTO members should give other WTO members equal non-discriminatory treatment. But having that kind of multilaterals to prioritize trade among each other with regards to criminal materials or criminal minerals is actually in some way violating the WTO. So I wonder whether you have any comments to that. The second question is, I wonder whether you notice that developing countries are really actually cutting trees to meet their climate target, because growing tree takes a lot of time, but cutting trees to install solar panels and other wind farms actually is much faster. So I want to know your comments. Thank you.
Thanks for these quick points.
No, on the first one, on the Mineral Security Partnership announced in June 2022, if you read the State Department press release carefully, it doesn't say that it is a partnership to create a buyer's club or a cartel or whatever. It does state that the purpose of this Mineral Security Partnership is to ensure that critical minerals and rare earths are extracted in an environmentally sustainable manner. Now, I will leave it to you to interpret what the underlying goals of the Mineral Security Partnership and whether they are going to be convergent with the stated goals, etc. And I wouldn't go much further into that. And as for the second point, which you said, when people are cutting down trees to erect solar panels, I would simply say, welcome to the world of law of unintended consequences. And also to the world where road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah, how do we get out of this course? How do we change our ways? No? I think this is a very important point. And to streamline the biodiversity agenda and the climate agenda, the protection of carbon sinks, I think this is what is in this question as well. I would take a few more questions.
Hi, my name is Rahul Bajore. I'm the chief economist at Barclays in India. So just to kind of look at what's happening right now, what we have seen effectively in the last 1 year, in the wake of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, is that a lot of Western economies themselves have kind of gone back in terms of their economic policies in order to support cost of living, issues through subsidies, etc. I mean, one could technically argue that this is sort of almost going back to, what the developing economies used to do in terms of supporting their, residents, and was kind of frowned upon, right, from a Washington consensus standpoint. I mean, if you are thinking about a just transition, I mean, it's going to be a fairly inflationary environment for most of these countries, and the fact that developed markets are going to be ahead of the cycle in terms of the timelines that have been committed on COP26. How do you think about, the next 5 to 10 years as to how do you, so because we will be in an environment of high interest rates and reasonably high inflation, is there a risk that this entire conversation basically collapses?
Amar, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and the question of the rollback on climate policy, and also what it means for future climate policy. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, so there is an element of hypocrisy, is what your question was, that developed countries, when pressed with their own energy insecurity, of course, are rolling back in terms of particularly what they are saying about fossil fuels. And that tension is real because ultimately energy security drives, all our behavior. We don't want to be without energy, and we do not want to be without affordable energy. But having said that, if you step back, we will all agree that therefore it gives an even greater imperative to build long-term energy security. And the potential there for global cooperation is enormous. If you look at the untapped energy potential in the Middle East, same place where we produce a lot of the world's fossil fuels, and you think about that being an energy solution for Europe, there's tremendous potential. So, Shell does a lot of far thinking in this area, and I would suggest that we really, think about the possibilities and then put in place the programs. Now, in terms of the environment, so it's correct that we are facing a higher inflationary environment, but there is, as you know, a very big debate within the economics profession about whether that is a 1 year, 2 year, or a long-term proposition. We are not yet settled on that issue. From the perspective of the developing world, the interest rate increase of 2 to 3% is immaterial when you think about other costs of capital. So in some sense, for them, the issue is going to be much more, can I get affordable capital, not the short-term fluctuation in the interest rate. And for particularly the renewable sector, that cost of capital, including here for smaller investors in India, is quite prohibitive. So you need practical solutions. You need co-investing, for example, in the early stages, you need the de-risking. And one point that was made, and why in this mystery, why doesn't institutional capital flow into the space? For 3 reasons. One, the investments are too small, so we have to aggregate them. Second, they are not investment grade. So somebody will have to provide first loss guarantees in order to be able to make it investment grade. And third, you have to be able to in some sense create a structure between the international investors and the local investors, which India is very well positioned to do, but we don't have it right now.
Natalie, you wanted to
Yeah,
to this?
I mean, I think sort of, looking at it at face value, indeed you see a massive contradiction there, right? I mean, you basically say, well, the 800 billion that I was referring to earlier, I mean, it's precisely basically a subsidy. It's an indirect subsidy to fossil fuels because it's basically assisting citizens with their utility bills. So that's basically what it is, right? Now, looking at it, though, differently, you could say, well, to what extent has all this actually allowed the mitigation of an economic recession? If we'd had this conversation exactly 1 year ago, and I would have said to you, well, look, Russia's going to turn off the taps, you would have said, well, this is a war economy scenario. I mean, this is an unprecedented economic recession. Well, it hasn't happened, right? Several other reasons, but this is part of it. And if we accept the premise that actually the transition requires economic growth, yeah? I mean, sort of CO2 emissions and growth are being decoupled is the whole sort of, recipe basically for the future. You're not going to have that transition if you're in an economic recession. So looking into it in a different way, you actually see that contradiction is actually not there.
Mallika, on the question of the role of inflation for environmental protection.
So at the risk of violently agreeing with the whole panel on I think so we look at this quite a bit in terms of policy ability to provide support, right? So monetary policy clearly is tightening. What does that mean? I mean, I think we see it as a flight to quality. I mean, if you look over the last 4 years, the kinds of companies that got funded, etc., you don't necessarily see I think it was a little bit indiscriminate. And so you're seeing a bit of a flight to quality that's happening in terms of focusing in on those sort of investments that either have more system-wide benefits or are scalable. So, there's a little bit more thought going into what is it that money goes into. It still remains the climate and energy transition is still a priority for investors. Amar mentioned GFANS, the Global Glasgow Alliance. It is still a priority because public policy is still a priority. So that, capital is following that. And that still remains through this energy security issue, at least in Europe and North America, you're still seeing that as a priority. So I think there's a little bit of nuance around the capital constraints coming in, but the fact that there might be a flight to quality and a focus on energy transition. So I think that this is good news there. On the fiscal side, I think we see a lot of constraints, obviously, because of the levels of debt governments have come out with. But I think there also I see sort of kernels of real positivity. The US Inflation Reduction Act is very clever because actually it doesn't have that much outlay. But it's going to leverage in. The idea is that it leverages in masses of private investment. And I think that's the way to make sure that your fiscal bang for the buck is maximized. And so I think, and Europe is, worried about it, but I think they're starting to realize that actually that kind of approach is going to, is the way to maintain and manage your public finances in a way that maximizes and directs private capital. So I think to me it's not all a bad news story in that regard.
Yeah, there's both positive and negative, and of course not all countries can afford this level of subsidies. So there's also this question of protectionism and justice. I would like to get a few more questions from the audience. So, did you have a question? Yeah, and then you, and then you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, thanks for a very illuminating conversation that the panel has generated. But we all are in a pickle, and it's a fairly serious one. I'm Sanjay Bhattacharya, a former diplomat, just retired, so I'm rewiring myself. But on this very issue, I think the way we haven't looked forward, because the literature is very rich on what the problem is. The policy options have been widely debated and discussed. But when we get to the negotiating table, and unfortunately, it is a question for negotiations at various COP processes and otherwise. It is always a protectionist attitude which prevents the implementation on the ground. And it's very few countries and instances that actually can make the breakthrough in trying to forge ahead and get ahead of the curve. The problem basically is that technology creates a certain problem which we don't fully recognize, and asymmetries of information do not allow that particular information to go through to all the stakeholders. So we do need technology which is going to correct the situation today. And I know that there is a lot of work that's going on, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector. The second issue that is there is the structures that are present today are totally inadequate for the challenges that we face because they were prejudiced and premised on a very different basis of maximization of other objectives. And the objective that we are trying to set ourselves today is not factored into these corporate or social responsibilities. Also inherent in this is the time frame that we have to look at, and I think this was also brought out by the panel very adequately, that we have to move from an annual cycle or a shorter cycle to one that is much more long-term. And finally, I think the question really is, and I'm very happy that the interests of the citizens or the individuals was brought up, because at the end of the day, it's really a question of awareness and education and empowerment so that you demand what it should be. And what we have faced today, it is no point saying that Europe is turning green, because it isn't. The per capita consumption and emissions are still amongst the highest. So we have to have a certain level of empowerment that is delivered, and we do need new mechanisms. Unfortunately, this can only come about through multilateral negotiations. But we have to drop some of our protectionist barriers that we still have. I'm seeing steady progress, but still way to go.
Okay, thank you so much for these statements to enrich our discussion. Please, I would like to cluster some questions, so please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Adas. I'm a professor at the Tel Aviv University. So I'm looking as a scientist, so I don't understand anything in economics, but I'm really worried about the end of the life, for example, of the solar panels, or looking at lithium. Are we doing enough to recycle, reuse, repurpose all the materials? Are we looking at what will happen in 20 years from now? So that the larger environmental issue of replacing fossil fuels with other ways of generating electricity, for example, or maybe using biomass or whatever. I just feel that what will happen to all those solar panels? Are we, for example, looking for solutions to repurpose all the waste that we're generating? So all the environmental big picture is really bothering me. So it's not a question, it's just a comment.
Thank you. I think the circular economy didn't feature specifically, but maybe underlying in some of these discussions. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. I'm Paul Cadario. I'm at the University of Toronto at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in the Center for Global Engineering. I want to focus this. I've tried to focus this on one question based on the our favorite words that are being thrown around tonight. And I'm going to focus on a word, de-risking. And I'm going to ask the whole panel, is there something about de-risking that would not break the international financial institutions, that would in fact bring in the shells and other private investors that are involved in both climate action and poverty eradication, and that would be acceptable to a country like India that has 800 million people in poverty and 18 states that, if they were independent countries, would be eligible for IDA. So maybe the whole panel could just say, when we say de-risking, what do you mean? And what would you do? Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to take a look into the audience again. Please.
Thank you. My name is Siddharthan from Climate Works Foundation, for a philanthropy based in San Francisco. And I had my colleagues from the Rockefeller Foundation sitting next to me, and we were discussing a few issues, how philanthropy could play a role. In Dr. Nageswaran, the first issue talked about critical minerals. Incidentally, last week, some of us gathered with the Terry, did a side session on exactly on this, because it's an energy security issue. What you raise is a serious risk. So if anything, the foundation side, if you could collaborate with you, and I will be happy to work and support, assist it. But that's the first thing I want to tell you. The second one is global finance. It's a one challenge. Amar and Nick, we had a call a few months ago, and how we could support India in the process in terms of how India could be a voice for South in the global green transition finance. That again, something we'll be working on the foundation side. My only comment there is how not be overwhelmed by the quantum of finance required. India GDP is 3.1 trillion in nominal terms, and the requirement is anything between 8 to 12 trillion tons. That's one. The third point I want to raise is more about, again, Dr. Nagesh, your point about what are the mechanisms by which we can generate internal revenue? I think very important at the national level. At the same time, state and the local level, municipal level, we have mechanism instruments. I think there are other great lessons in California, US, and Europe. I think how is there any way we can collaborate, learning, and also from India to other continents. Indonesia is keen, something we are thinking how we can collaborate between India and Indonesia, India and Africa, so that India could be a leader on some of the fiscal lesson generating revenue. Those are 3 comments from my side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I would now turn to the panel again and see who wants to react. We had a wealth of comments. There was a strong question on de-risking, what it means in specific context, and how could it be realized. Who would like to reply?
So, de-risking, borrowing Anand's thing, is an elephant in many forms, as you implied, Paul. So I'd say that the most important aspect of de-risking is the difficult task of putting in place a sound policy and institutional environment, because that's where the risks emanate from largely. And, that's something which countries are in the lead on, but we are having structures in place that is helping us identify those risks. For example, here in India, we have something which is a partnership between the CFLI, which is a private sector body. Internationally, the co-chair is the head of Tata's here. The Ministry of Finance is very much involved, and they sit around the table and they ask, where are the big impediments? Where are the big risks? What needs to be done? The second thing about de-risking is creating predictable structures for scalability. So you need to be able to understand that this is not going to be a transaction by transaction approach. Give you an example. If MIGA, the de-risking arm of the World Bank, comes in and says, I'm going to do one transaction in the state of Punjab, it doesn't have much impact. But if it says, I'm going to work with the central government and the state of Punjab to de-risk basically the discoms in Punjab, then you get both the pressure on the policy reform, but you get something that is scalable. And the final point about de-risking, and this is something which is, I call the dialogue of the deaf between institutional investors and the MDBs at this point in time, is, the BlackRocks of the world said, all we need from you are first loss guarantees. And the MDBs are saying, no, that's not our job. Your job is to take those risks. And actually, both sides are right and both sides are wrong. The devil is in the detail. So we do need to deepen the understanding and the conversations, but also come up with practical solutions in this area.
Thank you. So there's no uniform answer. Would you like to?
I don't want to add anything more to what Amar said, except to correct the statistic that the gentleman gave. India doesn't have 800 million people in poverty. That is a very, very wrong number. That's massively overstated. So I just want to correct that impression. Nothing more.
So I can pick up the circular economy, bringing the science to the economics, if you like. So I think we're seeing more and more, and again, the price of some of these goods, commodities, is going up so much that you're seeing suddenly a much greater interest in trying to recycle some of these materials out of batteries, for example. So that's the example I can think of. There's a company set up, I was just looking it up because I forgot the name, Redwood Materials. It's an ex-Tesla founder who's now moved to set up something called Redwood Materials that recycles battery metals and takes that out. And so again, and the response that's happened because he's seen what sort of the demand for electric vehicle batteries is going to look like, and he's seen the price of those commodities and how they're going up. And so this is a business opportunity that he seized and created a business model out of. So again, I think, as you see some of these things sort of come to front to mind, and as you see the bottlenecks starting to appear, you will see more sort of entrepreneurial activity in this space. At least that's my belief as an economist, responding to the scientist.
Thanks. We also had this tension between multilateralism and protectionism. Natalie, do you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, I think this is a really important and interesting question to which I don't actually have an answer, but let me put it this way. For a long time, and we still do, we've been talking about climate as, your sort of archetypal global public goods problem that by definition requires multilateral solutions. And here we are in a world in which, hey, as these global cleavages are increasing, that is obviously becoming more difficult, yeah? So whether this is a global north, global south, whether this is US-China competition, we basically see the way in which these rivalries, these tensions are imperiling multilateralism. But then you also have a different story, which goes to your protectionism point. Now here Mallika earlier was saying, hey, hooray for the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, in a sense, the Inflation Reduction Act is, if you want to be very, very generous, you look at it as a decarbonization policy. If you want to be a little bit more realistic, you say, well, it's at least as much a decarbonization policy as a response to the competition with China, right? Now, this raises the question as to whether competition can, does it spur more decarbonization or hinder climate action? Because it does both at the same time. And that's what I'm saying. I don't have the answer as to which one is going to weigh more heavily than the other.
So again,
I think it should be raised to the top. Sorry.
do you want to come in?
No, I was just...
Okay. Not on the record. So yeah, I think the interpretation of some policies is also part of the truth. No, you said we should have a truthful dialogue and also realistic expectations. So I think there's often many viewpoints to one policy. So I think this is what this discussion brought out as well. We are running a bit short on time. We have 6 minutes left in this discussion. And I would like to give a final question to the panel, which is very concrete in your respective positions. What are you doing over the next, let's say, 12 months that will advance the agenda of climate mitigation or adaptation, climate finance? What is in your book for this year, for the next 12 months, that ties into this and that could give us some optimism for the future as well?
Practical solutions right now to help scale up renewable energy everywhere in the world as a foundation for the energy transition. I think making the India model happen, which is not yet the case here and is certainly not the case outside.
Mm-hmm.
At our level, we are trying to influence the right sequence of actions that need to be taken in terms of preparedness. Because I think if we put the renewable energy horse before the cart before the horse, without putting in place availability of metals and minerals, etc., then we are going to run into problems. So it's the right sequencing. So pitching for the right sequence of policy measures at the national level and at the global level is what we are trying to do. And with your permission, I would just like to leave the distinguished audience here with one paper or an article rather that is going to be 1 year old in about 10 days. You just have to use your browser and type Korea, South Korea, island, Bloomberg, net zero. You will come across this article called An Island Paradise Offers a Cautionary Tale for Net Zero Goals. And this article appeared at first on March 12th, 2022. I understand that this article is open not only for subscribers, but also for non-subscribers.
Thanks for the further reading.
Homework.
Yeah, homework.
I'll send it to you.
So for me, it's about seeing through the current uncertainty. We've seen sort of cost of living, energy prices going through the roof, a reversion to bringing coal back. But I think seeing through that uncertainty to the energy transition. Because in my view, the best hedge against this uncertainty for a company is to invest for low carbon. because no matter what, this energy transition is happening. We can debate the speed at which it's happening, but it is happening. And so to me, it's working within Shell to think through the uncertainty we see today, and to help to make decisions that are robust in the longer term, in the direction of the energy transition.
I mean, I would say, sort of speaking as a European, kind of, making the case more for lifting our gaze. So inevitably, especially over the last year, we've been very much concentrated on putting ourselves in safety and security. And mind you, I think it was the absolutely right thing and inevitable thing to do. But I think it is also true that as we've been, gas hoarding, we have indirectly contributed for, others' problems. And so I think that moving forward, as we have hopefully passed the peak of the energy crisis, not only should we be thinking about continuing to accelerate our own transition, but in a sense, really globalizing our way in which we look at this dichotomy. There isn't a dichotomy between energy security and the energy transition worldwide.
Thanks. I hope we can meet here or elsewhere again in a year and come back and see that we have removed some of these roadblocks that we discussed today. And what makes me hopeful is that maybe 5-10 years ago, our discussion would have gone another way, albeit maybe with less geopolitical challenges. Maybe the discussion on climate would have been less progressive than it has been today. So for this, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank our audience who was very patient with us and who has brought very important topics to the table. We have to move forward together rather than moving apart. So let's do that. Thank you very much.